In late November of 1989, emergency responders kicked down the door to a one-story family home in the Lake Highlands neighborhood of East Dallas, Texas. The property belonged to a former university business professor, 48-year-old David Goodman, and his wife, Glenda, neither of whom had been seen in weeks. Investigators, upon breaking into the home, were soon met with the vile stench of death, and sure enough, they found the Goodmans deceased on the floor of their garage. Police recovered a .22 caliber revolver from the scene. In the coming weeks, it would unravel that the Goodmans had been involved in a New Age religious movement called Conscious Development of Body, Mind and Soul, led by a woman named Terri Hoffman. Notably, shortly before their deaths, the Goodmans had left a considerable amount of their wealth and assets to Hoffman, and they weren't the only ones. During her career as a cult leader, Hoffman was surrounded by death. 8 of her followers died in accidents or by suicide, along with 2 of her husbands. Even today, the exact circumstances of these deaths and how big a part, if any, Hoffman played in them remains a mystery. But who exactly was Terri Hoffman? And what did her New Age cult, Conscious Development of Body, Mind and Soul, preach? In this documentary, we aim to explore these questions and more as we examine the strange case of Terri Hoffman and the Conscious Development cult. Terri Hoffman was born on March 21, 1938 in Fort Stockton, Texas. Growing up, her family was devastatingly poor. Her sister had been stillborn and her mother was dying of tuberculosis. At the age of 9, she was sent to a Lutheran orphanage in Round Rock, a city of over 330 miles from Fort Stockton, where she would remain for 2 years until she was adopted by a Dallas Oil Company clerk and his wife. She was subsequently renamed Terri Lee Benson. Hoffman would later claim that her first encounter with beings she called masters occurred when she was just 3.5 years old and living with her biological parents. Masters were described by Hoffman as wise spirit guides who occasionally appeared to her on Earth to offer advice to and about her followers. Most people couldn't see or hear them, but Hoffman could. When she was still living in the orphanage, she claimed that she discovered that she was the reincarnation of Saint Teresa of Avila, a 16th century nun and supposed mystic who is said to have experienced visions from the Holy Trinity. For 4 years, Hoffman lived with her adoptive parents in peace. However, a month after her 15th birthday, she ran away from home to marry 18-year-old truck driver and high school dropout John Ray Wilder, whom her new mother labelled a thug. Both Hoffman and John lied about their ages on their marriage certificate, claiming each to be 3 years older than they were. They subsequently tied the knot in Durant, Oklahoma, before returning to Dallas. 18 months later, Hoffman became pregnant with her first child and dropped out of high school. She gave birth to her eldest daughter, Kathy, in 1954, and would go on to have 2 more children with John Wilder. Their son, Kenneth, was born in 1958, followed by their youngest daughter, Virginia, 5 years later. Together, the family lived on a quaint rural property in South Dallas County, with John single-handedly supporting the family as a trucker, while Hoffman became a stay-at-home mother, though she yearned for more. Between all the child rearing, cleaning and cooking, Hoffman managed to find some free time for herself. which she used to begin reading books about the occult, including topics such as psychics and hypnotism. She also found like-minded friends with whom she discussed the origin of the universe, the meaning of life, and meditation. Later, when the children began attending school and she had more time on her hands, Hoffman began taking classes in hypnosis, as well as other topics. By the late 1960s, the family had relocated to Farms Branch, a North Dallas suburb, where Hoffman had started leading weekly meditation classes. It was on the back of this meditation class that Hoffman decided to put together conscious development of body, mind and soul, at the time not described as a New Age religion or a cult, but simply a group she taught. She educated her followers from lessons she'd written up at home and offered for sale. The following is an excerpt from Hoffman's first lesson. This is your very first lesson. It is yours in a special way, since the knowledge contained within it is sacred, secret, and mysterious. This information has been treasured and carefully guarded since ancient times, for knowledge gives its possessor power. By being exposed to the teachings of the masters, you will not only become aware of the truths which others rarely possess, you will also learn how to use and control energies few have mastered. Hoffman's classes were spent sitting cross-legged on the floor, listening to her advice on various topics from relationships to personal finance. She subsequently led her followers into a trance-like state before finishing up with a round of prayer. One ex-member of the movement recalled that Hoffman offered individual consultations at an hourly rate, noting she would advise them on every aspect of their life. Hoffman was a firm believer in karma and claimed that actions carried out on Earth, the physical realm, would affect opportunities for reincarnation in the spiritual realm. She was also not shy of warning her followers that those experiencing bad luck and misfortune were doing so as a result of bad decisions they'd made in previous lives. Those who behaved poorly in one life were destined to be condemned, possibly even being reincarnated as a cockroach or rodent in their next life. Hoffman also taught that the main goal of the group was to become evolved enough to be able to join God and the Masters on the spiritual plane during their next life. She stated that this would only be possible if her followers committed strongly to her teachings. If you wish to enter the highest realms, you need to work to develop the latent power of your emotions, mind, and soul. She also stressed the importance of one's balance between their physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual bodies, stating that those who wish to secure a successful next life would need to make sure they achieve stability and equality between those four aforementioned bodies. She claimed that negative thoughts, which she named negative energies, could be draining and possibly even fatal. For example, a fear of cancer could cause cancer. When Hoffman suffered from noticeable physical injuries or illnesses, she would later tell her followers that she was enduring punishment on their behalf from the Black Lords, the group's enemies, who we will discuss later. As for death, though, Hoffman was unfazed. She wrote in her teachings, "You will also become conscious of the continuity of life. Death then will not exist in reality, for you will realize that your existence is not dependent upon the mere maintenance of your physical body. The result of noble death is rebirth." Another main teaching Hoffman pushed was that attachments were the most insidious and deceitful of the destructive patterns. Hoffman, though, was not referring to sentimental objects or materialistic greed. She was referring to people. She encouraged her followers to limit their involvement with others, including relatives, parents, and children. She wrote that such attachments could leave no time for spiritual devotions. The liberation of your own soul is the one thing for which you are in this world. This specific teaching would help Hoffman to cultivate the most loyal of followings and the tightest of inner circles. Peter Elkind wrote for Texas Monthly in 1990 that Hoffman was tapping the angst of a restless generation with traditional religion and its inability to provide clear answers to impossible questions. which is in part what led to the success of her movement. Later, New Age religions in the 1980s would be heavily inspired by Hoffman's teachings. Furthermore, Elkind wrote that during the 1960s, Dallas was filled with divorce, materialism, and the pursuit of personal pleasure, while Hoffman's writings offered forgiveness of sin, reinforcement of pleasure. She told followers what they wanted to hear. They would become comfortable with wealth. They would find bliss in every sexual encounter. Like many similar movements, Hoffman was promising a life of pleasure and prosperity, and her followers believed that to achieve the life they wanted, all they had to do was follow her teachings. Despite everything that she taught, however, Hoffman's personal life wasn't exactly smooth sailing. Her husband John was becoming disillusioned with her teachings. By late December 1970, Hoffman had filed for divorce. She told a friend that John was impeding my spiritual growth, and told others it was his alleged unfounded jealousy of a younger follower, a man named Glenn Cooley, that forced her to go to court. Following the filing of the divorce papers, though, John and Hoffman's adoptive mother had the 32-year-old temporarily committed to Parkland Memorial Hospital so that she could be psychiatrically evaluated. A judge agreed after being told that Hoffman was a danger to herself and those around her. While it's unknown what exactly was decided during her stay, when Hoffman's divorce was later granted on March 23, 1971, she lost custody of Kenneth and Virginia, her two youngest children. Hoffman didn't remain single for long, however. In the summer of 1971, just 4 months after her divorce was granted, she married Glenn Scott Cooley, a 20-year-old North Texas State University student whom she alleges her ex-husband was jealous of. Glenn dropped out of school after the couple tied the knot. Together, the couple purchased and moved into a house on Dunhaven Road in North Dallas. Hoffman subsequently threw herself full-time into conscious development of body, mind, and soul. Alongside providing copies of her lessons and offering private consultation, Hoffman began selling crystals and jewelry. She claimed that certain gemstones possessed protective and healing properties, but added that only those that had been properly selected and charged would do so. She encouraged her followers to purchase her products for their own benefit and noted that the more expensive the item, the more power it contained. She offered an array of handmade silver rings, necklaces, and bracelets, as well as standalone crystals and gems. The more of her jewelry a conscious development member owned, the more dedicated they were to the cause. Meanwhile, conscious development continued to grow in popularity. With more followers than ever, Hoffman realized that she couldn't do all the teaching alone, so she chose 25 of her most faithful group members to act as teachers on her behalf, running some of her classes so that she could focus on bigger things. By this point, Hoffman had grown into such an admired figure that her followers began calling her the Antamagi, the divine revelator. This newly bestowed title began to go to Hoffman's head, or perhaps her ego was already inflated anyway. She began to claim all sorts of amazing feats, that she could levitate, heal sick people, even those who were hundreds of miles from her, and communicate with Plato, as well as Babai, a legendary Himalayan guru. One of Hoffman's followers, who was later chosen to be a teacher, recalled being on a flight that went out of control after bumping a telephone wire, only for the pilot to regain control and avoid disaster. Hoffman would later claim that she helped save those aboard the flight. As time passed, Hoffman's charisma attracted more and more people. She then began to host weekly meetings with those she considered her most loyal followers, the same people she'd chosen to become teachers. She informed this inner circle that they were now members of the White Brotherhood and that they'd been chosen by the masters to fight against the evil that was looming over them. Hoffman explained that these new threats were called Black Lords, and they were part of the opposing Black Brotherhood. The White Brotherhood would need to take it upon themselves to combat these evil entities and keep the world safe. Hoffman's teachings wrote that the Black Lords exist on the astral and mental planes. and as such were not physical beings walking the earth. They could only be destroyed by being taken to the pits of hell, where their souls and lower bodies would be dissolved. But Hoffman warned the Black Lords weren't their worst enemy. There were also Black Overlords, who were a more powerful and terrifying version of Lords. Overlords, she explained, could not be slain the same way. They would instead need to be taken to the electromagnetic dissolving cave. A further enemy the White Brotherhood would need to combat were beings Hoffman called Garbans. She described them as being about 6 feet tall with a long beak. Garbans have a gargoyle-like appearance, covered with slime. They have ever been known to be able to so touch one in the physical as to leave slime on the body of their victim. Hoffman then detailed how to harm Garbans, writing, "If after 30 seconds or a minute you feel a tingling sensation in your hand, or if your hand is shaking, you should assume that you have a Garban stuck to the hand. Using your imagination, wrap it in barbed wire, stab it, and kill it. Then imagine the dead Garban spinning straight up and dissolving in the universe." After explaining all of this, Hoffman went on to reveal to the White Brotherhood how they would challenge their enemies. They would do so by arming themselves with 4 items which would serve as representations of the elements: fire, water, and earth. The items would be a rod, a cup, a sword, and a bag containing dirt. She also explained that everyone would need to dress for battle wearing a properly made robe, which would provide the teachers with up to 15 times more power. They would also need to wear Hoffman's handmade jewellery. Hoffman subsequently led the teachers through a series of protection rituals before they began slicing at the air with ballpoint pens and letter openers, their makeshift swords, as they began to fight the Black Lords and other beings. Despite the spiritual nature of these fights, many of the White Brotherhood members felt their encounters were real and posed the risk of death. One teacher later wrote, "We had to rush to the aid of some of our White Brotherhood as they fought. Many of these brothers died on that far-off universe because they were not as battle-ready as we have been and will be." These battles were taken so seriously by Hoffman's followers that she appointed lieutenants who wrote to her to keep her informed, as if they were a real military unit in the middle of a war. They often tallied up the body count and wrote of the bleak outcomes of their encounters, stating, "Our first battle fought took over 3 hours and dissolved only 242 lords and no overlords. The so-called fights would last for hours, leaving teachers exhausted. Attacks, lieutenants noticed, began to occur more and more frequently. They described the White Brotherhood as becoming desperate, noting our need for help was crucial. The teachers, however, didn't receive any help. They'd been sworn to secrecy, and only those inside the White Brotherhood were able to engage with the Black Lords. This led to many members becoming paranoid, desperate, and deeply unsettled as their enemies loomed over them, ready to strike at any given moment. In November 1976, Hoffman filed for divorce from her 25-year-old husband, Glenn Cooley. Though his Baptist parents never approved of conscious development, Glenn had continued to support his wife as she and her group grew in popularity, and he worked full-time for Hoffman's jewellery business. However, when he caught wind of Hoffman's talk about the Black Lords, he decided that he no longer wanted to be part of the marriage. His mother later testified that her son wanted out of the whole thing, the marriage, the conscious development, everything. Though he didn't support conscious development's new direction, the divorce was, by all accounts, amicable, and Glenn stayed on working on the jewellery business. Their divorce was finalised on January the 27th, 1977. However, just 5 days later, Glenn was found dead. He had left a note inside Hoffman's safe titled "Last Will and Testament." In his will, he left all of his belongings, including his Buick Limited, 2 boats, and all of his furnishings, to his ex-wife. Hoffman later told investigators that after finding the note, she and 2 followers went to Glenn's cabin, where they found him dead in bed. His death was ultimately attributed to a drug overdose due to the presence of Valium and Librium in his blood. Though Glenn had been described as dabbling with drugs when he'd married Hoffman, his suicide came as a surprise to those who knew him. Hoffman, for her part, claimed that he had seemed in low spirits recently. For 13 years, her version of events was seen to be the truth. But in 1989, a former member of the White Brotherhood told investigators that she and Hoffman had visited Glenn's cabin on February the 2nd, the night of his death. She said on their way to see him, Hoffman told her that Glenn was going to the next level. When they arrived, the 25-year-old was still lucid and explained that he'd taken the fatal drugs. But Glenn's death was just the beginning. One of Hoffman's most devoted followers was Sandy Cleaver. An Alabama native, Sandy was a young woman who'd been raised in an affluent family and who had plenty of money thanks to a trust fund. Considered sheltered and naive, she'd met her husband Chuck while at university. In 1960, she moved with him to Dallas, and in 1964, Sandy gave birth to their first and only daughter, Susan Devereaux. Sandy was described as spiritually troubled. Her parents had divorced during her childhood, and her mother was mentally ill, having been in and out of hospitals for most of Sandy's life. Compounding her troubles was the fact that her sister had died in a car accident, and in 1966, her father passed away in a plane crash. Confused, lost, and searching for answers, Sandy eventually discovered Terri Hoffman and her teachings. In 1971, around the same time Hoffman left her first husband, Sandy left Chuck. She told him that she and Hoffman had decided that he was blocking her spiritual development. A long-winded custody battle for Susan soon broke out. Chuck labelled Sandy an unfit mother, noting her reluctance to take their daughter to real medical doctors, instead relying on prayer and incense when Susan became ill. Sandy was also known to give her daughter unidentified pills prescribed to her by an unlicensed healer in Mexico who claimed he could diagnose Susan telepathically. The healer had been recommended by Hoffman. Chuck added that Sandy had become so deeply immersed in Hoffman's teachings that it was becoming dangerous, and would later testify that she was giving their daughter 110 unlabeled pills a day. He also stated that he decided to stop battling for custody because he feared Sandy would rather harm their daughter, as she believed Susan would be reincarnated, as Hoffman had taught, and give him custody. The best Chuck managed to get was a special provision of the divorce, which stated that Sandy could only take their daughter to recognized physicians licensed to practice in Texas. Following this, Sandy became Hoffman's unpaid full-time assistant. She rewrote the group's course, purchasing a printing press with her own money, helped make jewelry, and kept their books in order. In 1974, Hoffman legally incorporated Conscious Development and named Sandy as secretary-treasurer. As part of her job, she left town for days at a time, leaving her daughter in the care of the family's elderly housekeeper, Louise Watson. By all accounts, Sandy was deeply involved with the movement and very excited about its future. Her bond with Hoffman seemed to grow deeper every day, and she firmly believed that her work was worth every and any sacrifice. Things took a turn in 1978, however, when a new threat began to loom. Hoffman informed Sandy and the other members of the White Brotherhood that the Black Lords now had the power to poison blood, and claimed that those who became infected would need to withdraw a single syringe worth of blood to remove the poison from their system. She called this bloodletting practice a defense strategy, and almost surprisingly, it was enough to make some people question the movement before leaving Conscious Development altogether. Even Hoffman's inner circle shrank, but Sandy Cleaver remained. By this time, Susan was 14 years old, and she was beginning to grow upset by her mother's distance and the fact that she was always away from home. Susan was an avid sports player and the star member of her school's basketball team, but Sandy never turned up to her games to support her. In 1979, though, Susan was thrilled when her mother asked her to attend a pre-wedding trip to Hawaii. A few years earlier, Sandy had met Lynn Fairchild and the two planned to get married, despite Hoffman's warnings and advice that the two were not to marry, but to stay happy single people. On February 25th, while on a picnic at a lagoon near Wailupi Peninsula, a picturesque spot Hoffman had previously visited and recommended, Sandy and Susan decided to paddle out on an inflatable raft. According to Sandy, a sudden wave knocked the two of them from the raft as they drifted over a sharp coral reef, and another drove them apart and pushed them beneath the water. Sandy looked for her daughter but was unable to find her, and shortly afterwards she was rescued, bruised and bleeding, while atop a coral reef. Hours later, Susan's body was recovered. Chuck was alerted to the events of the day by Hoffman at around 1 a.m. The pair encountered one another in Hawaii that afternoon, in Sandy's hospital room. While he was there, a conscious development member attempted to call him at home, claiming she had an important document. That document was soon found to be Susan's will and was addressed to Hoffman and her third husband, Ben Johnson. The teenager had left $125,000, all her trust fund money, to Hoffman and her movement. She added that it was to be used for the conscious development school that Hoffman and her mother had planned to create. Bizarrely, a second will, formal and dated the previous August, also appeared. It too left all of her property to Hoffman, who has been like a second mother to me, the document read. This version of the will contained legal jargon and adult language unlike the first, which had clearly been penned by a child. Both documents, however, were invalid, as minors cannot create a legal will in Texas. Susan's father, Chuck, found the documents suspicious. As far as he knew, the 14-year-old barely had any interactions with Hoffman, and he later stated his belief that Susan had written the document at her mother's request to please her. There is some speculation that Sandy was responsible for her daughter's demise, as she had spoken openly to her colleagues that she was frightened of Susan, claiming evil spirits inside of her were trying to infect Sandy's energies. This was in part why she remained so aloof, even though Susan wanted nothing more than to receive her mother's love and praise. Sandy subsequently broke off her engagement to Lynn Fairchild, but remained close to Hoffman. Hoffman herself would lose a child of her own later that year, when her only son, Kenneth, plunged to his death while constructing a commercial building in Grand Prairie. He was just 22 years old. In his will, he left everything he had to his mother. 2 months after Susan's death, Sandy took out an insurance policy worth $300,000. Hoffman was the sole beneficiary. Later that year, she also transferred her $180,000 property over to Hoffman and began paying her rent to continue living in her home. 2 years later, on September the 8th, 1981, Sandy and her elderly housekeeper, Louise, set out on a 6-day trip to Colorado, where she planned to visit some land the group had purchased near Cripple Creek, as they wanted to build a retreat on it. The two women spent their first night in Colorado Springs with Hoffman's sister. The following day, they set out to visit the Conscious Development property, but instead, that evening, in an area known as the Garden of the Gods, Sandy drove straight off a mountain. Investigators would later determine that despite the sharp curve, Sandy had not attempted to veer or stop the vehicle. The car plunged 500 feet into a ravine. Sandy and Louise were tossed from the vehicle on its way down. Their bodies were discovered well above the wreckage of the car. Hoffman arrived at the hospital 2 days later to claim the bodies. Sandy had updated her will 3 months before her death, naming Hoffman as her sole beneficiary. She was also the beneficiary of her $300,000 life insurance policy. Louise, too, had named Hoffman as the recipient of her estate. Still, accessing the Cleaver estate would prove difficult for Hoffman, as Sandy's brother contested her will. He claimed that it was the result of undue influence and fraud, arguing that his sister lacked the ability to exercise freely independent thoughts and reasoning, and that she was controlled by proponents' use of hypnosis, Pavlovian condition, and psychotherapy. Hoffman denied controlling Sandy while being questioned during a pre-trial deposition, but admitted that she'd attempted hypnosis on her friend on 2 occasions. The case subsequently went to trial in June 1982, but after 5 days of testimony, Hoffman decided it would be easier to settle. She agreed to pay Sandy's brother $112,500 in cash and 40% of the net proceeds from the sale of her home. Her furnishings and other possessions would be divided equally between the two. Following Sandy's death, Hoffman halted all conscious development classes for a period of time. Despite the string of odd deaths, the bloodletting, and the dispute with Sandy's brother, Hoffman retained a strong following. Though members of the group rarely had formal meetings, They socialized often, becoming incredibly close-knit, just as Hoffman had always wanted. By the mid-1980s, she'd added more business to her roster. She began making perfume and offered acupressure massage therapy, which she claimed was designed to unclog the body's blocked energy centers. She even put together a workshop on the oil business, as she became somewhat of a financial guru on top of everything else. In 1980, Hoffman divorced her third husband and married yet another one of her followers, a man named Don Hoffman. Don and his ex-wife Alice were devout followers of conscious development who joined in 1974 after their daughter had accidentally drowned in the swimming pool. Like her previous husbands, Don quit his career after marrying Hoffman so that he could work for conscious development full-time. Meanwhile, Sandy's role as Hoffman's right-hand woman was filled in by Robin Ostott. By the mid-1980s, Robin had become so entrenched in the movement that she barely spoke with or saw her parents and seemed oblivious to her teenage son. A friend of hers recalled, her whole life revolved around the boy until she met Terri Hoffman. Then her whole life revolved around Terri Hoffman. Though Robin had frequent consultations with Hoffman and underwent several rounds of massage therapy, she couldn't shake the feeling of dark hopelessness that had come over her. She had become deeply depressed. In her journals, she wrote that she felt her bodies, which were to be carefully balanced at all times, had turned against her. She was shortly afterwards abandoned by her conscious development friends after she assaulted a fellow member whom she believed was some sort of threat to her life. Robin blamed the Black Lords, trying to explain that they were taking over her bodies and wreaking havoc. On April the 19th, 1987, she told her ex-husband that she'd contracted hepatitis and that the diagnosis was terminal. Her confused ex-husband, though, set up a doctor's appointment for her, which Robin attended. Later, the rest results would show that there was no disease in her system. After her doctor's appointment that day, Robin visited Hoffman. She subsequently returned home and took her own life with a .38 caliber revolver. Robin left no note for her son, nor any explanation of her actions. Instead, she scribbled a message for Hoffman, which stated, "I am apologizing to Terri 3000X, a WK on all levels of my being, for the highly offensive, rude, and vulgar comments made to her last week. I love her dearly and beg her forgiveness someday." Her will had been written 2 months earlier. The majority of her possessions were to go to Hoffman. Robin wrote that whatever her son didn't want was to also go to Hoffman. 7 months later, on November the 30th, a conscious development member named Mary Alice Levinson was found dead in her Chicago hotel room. Her cause of death was listed as a drug overdose after she'd ingested 2 kinds of prescription sleeping pills. Notably, just 2 weeks before her demise, she changed the beneficiary of her life insurance policy. Originally, Mary's youngest brother was listed, but she removed him from the policy and added her boyfriend instead. Mary had met her partner through Hoffman while on a spiritual retreat. Chillingly, she'd recorded a message for her parents, which was later recovered by police. In the recording, she spoke of her demise, stating, "I want you to understand that I am fully rational and I have come to this decision after a long time of thinking. I'm actually looking forward to it. Obviously, with my past work with animals, I believe in euthanasia for those who are suffering horribly." That same year, 39-year-old Charles Southern Jr., a prominent member of the group, disappeared. Charles worked at a community college in Chicago, and in his free time, he was a teacher with conscious development. By all accounts, he was close to Hoffman and her inner circle, frequently visiting her home in Dallas. Earlier in the year, Charles was reportedly found wandering the streets of Chicago while speaking in tongues. After a short stay in the hospital, he returned to his regular life, but suddenly lost interest in Hoffman and her work, though he remained involved with the organization. In December, Charles had plans to spend 2 weeks in India. However, his family never saw him again. Inside his home, his loved ones discovered his passport. It contained no stamps from India. They also found a small vial in one of his drawers containing some sort of substance, as well as what appeared to be 2 wills. Though Hoffman was reportedly confronted about Charles's disappearance, she denied being involved. To this day, what became of Charles Southern Jr. is still unknown, as he has never been found. His case became the subject of an episode of Unsolved Mysteries during the 90s.
Peace, harmony, enlightenment, and 11 untimely deaths. This is a legacy of an obscure spiritual movement. When a respected young English professor joined up, his family became concerned. Now he's disappeared, and they're asking for your help.
The episode also featured the case of Jill Bounds and noted the bizarre deaths occurring around Hoffman. In 1988, 2 people linked to the movement were found dead, the first of which was Hoffman's 4th husband, 50-year-old Don Hoffman. On September the 16th, Don was discovered dead in his hotel room at the Marriott Hotel in Las Colinas, Texas. The scene of his death was similar to that of Hoffman's 2nd husband, Glenn Cooley. Don had died from mixed drug intoxication. In 3 recorded video messages, which were identical and addressed to his siblings and children, Don made tearful goodbyes to his family, claiming that he had cancer and that he'd seen 3 specialists who told him it was terminal and inoperable. He added that Hoffman's heart was kind of weak and any undue stress or pressure on her right now would be really bad. He told his family to help her as much as they could before stating, "Death is just a transition from one life to another life."
By now, I'm sure you've heard of my death, and I'm sorry to have to put you through this way. He ran some tests and found that I had terminal non-operable cancer. I'm not really afraid of death. I came to terms with it many years ago.
Don's autopsy revealed that there was no cancer. Hoffman claimed that her husband had been experiencing trouble breathing for some time now, but noted that he'd never told her of his diagnosis. She said he had some pills that she'd asked him about, but he told her he'd been prescribed them by a doctor and she'd pushed no further. But Don had ecstasy in his system, not the kind of drug a doctor would supply. Though his children were suspicious in the circumstances of his death, and the doctors who falsely diagnosed Don with terminal cancer were never identified, Hoffman managed to avoid any real conflict with Don's family for several months. In the spring of the following year, Don's will was filed by attorneys. He'd left everything to Hoffman. 4 days after Don's death, a former member of the group, 41-year-old Jill Bounds, was found dead in her home, having been beaten to death. Jill had been deeply involved with the movement until 1982, when she departed from the group. She was last seen alive on September the 20th and was found several days later after she missed meetings with her friends. Investigators determined that the attacker had entered through a window and had attempted to clean up in the bathroom, as evidenced by blood found there. Notably, the perpetrator had also gone through Jill's diary and pulled out several pages. Furthermore, some pricey jewellery she owned, along with a handgun, was missing from her home, though other expensive jewellery had been left behind. Jill was reportedly afraid of Hoffman, but had visited her in the months before her demise. Her case has never been solved. The last deaths connected to the conscious development movement were those we mentioned in the introduction to this video: 48-year-old David Goodman and his wife, Glenda. David was deeply involved in the movement and had been since 1973. He had been married to his first wife until 1970, when she up and left him, taking the children. Hoffman attempted to set him up twice unsuccessfully, with each marriage lasting only a few months at most. However, her most recent attempt at matchmaking had been a success. David married Glenda in 1984, referring to her as his soulmate. Glenda thought highly of David too, telling Hoffman she just wished she'd met him sooner. Hoffman informed her that she had. They'd been married in previous lifetimes. By this time, David was so energized in the teachings of the movement that he wanted all of his and Glenda's energy and time to be focused on one another, their spiritual development, and the work they could do for conscious development. As a result of this, shortly before the couple tied the knot, Glenda sent her 2 children to live with their father, who later moved from Houston to Singapore. Glenda and David decided to set strict visitation limits too. The children would be welcome for just 2 weeks during the summer. This mean-spirited decision left Glenda's parents in shock. Her mother went to church and prayed for her, later stating, "It was devastating. That was when the real Glenda died." Glenda and David would be found in their home in November of 1989, 5 weeks after their deaths and 10 months after either party had last spoken to their parents. Glenda had started writing a letter to her son, but had abandoned it before it could be sent. It painted the portrait of a severely unhappy woman, with Glenda writing, "I'm extremely depressed right now and would love to have the nerve to kill myself, but so far I can't get up gumption." The couple had left no note behind, and their dogs were malnourished and alone in their back garden. Investigators also recovered evidence in the form of handwritten journals that revealed the pair had been plotting their own deaths for months, believing that God had instructed them to do so. It seemed that in the months leading up to their deaths, they had become increasingly frustrated by the fact that they were not achieving the level of ascension that Hoffman had. Despite David passing test after test by willingly offering up any and all money he had, he was still unable to speak with the masters or God, or jump between the physical and spiritual realms at will. They felt that just as Hoffman's writings had taught, they were being held down by bad karma. David wrote, "God, I don't feel that I can continue. God, are you just going to leave us stranded in this bad state? You have made me a stupid weakling." Glenda later added, "Marcus," the name given to one of the masters, "Terri, Christ. Please explain to me and give me the understanding of why you have treated us so cruelly for all these many years, and especially now at the very end." They eventually became utterly despondent, with David noting, "There is no hope, there is nothing to live for. There is only a God who tortures us endlessly." Hoffman claimed that she'd not heard from the couple for several months before their deaths, but their house was noted to have paraphernalia related to the movement, including handwritten notes and letters. Furthermore, shortly before their deaths, the pair had written checks to Hoffman, totaling almost $100,000. It was still very much ingrained in the culture surrounding conscious development. On March 3rd, 1989, Don Hoffman's children, Rick and Janet, filed a lawsuit against their father's widow. The suit claimed that Terri Hoffman, now 51, had brought about Don's death using mind control techniques, as well as hypnosis, behavior modification, information control, and manipulation of emotions. They filed a second lawsuit less than 2 months later, looking to contest Don's will. Notably, the lawyer who represented Rick and Janet was the same one who'd represented Sandy Cleaver's brother back in 1981. This lawyer, James Barklow, decided to inspect Hoffman's rubbish bins to see what he could find. James uncovered dozens of needles and syringes, cotton swabs, and enough emptied pill bottles to stock a pharmacy. He also recovered a letter from a San Diego-based man discussing an order of drugs. This evidence prompted the DA's office to begin looking into Hoffman and her illicit use of substances. They believed that with the help of doctors, Hoffman illegally dispensed pills and gave injections which she referred to as vitamin shots. The DA was also made aware that 2 of Hoffman's husbands had died from drug overdoses, that the Goodmans journal contained references to white pills, and that David Goodman's son, who had a friendship with Hoffman, was arrested in 1986 for possession of ecstasy. Hoffman and Conscious Development denied any wrongdoing, while her lawyer referred to the DA's investigation as a witch hunt. After 4 years, no evidence was found linking Hoffman to the 10 deaths that surrounded her during the 1970s and 80s. In 1991, Hoffman filed for bankruptcy. 3 years later, she was given 6 months behind bars for 10 counts of bankruptcy fraud, though she was released after just 12. Though Terri Hoffman was never charged with any deaths, many of those who lost loved ones involved with conscious development still hold her solely responsible. Leonard Goodman, the father of David, told Texas Monthly, "If my son hadn't been involved with Terri Hoffman, he'd be alive today. So would a lot of other people." When speaking with the LA Times, he added, "I'd like to see it go to trial and see her brought up on murder charges. But the fact that my son's dead will never go away." The families of deceased members had hoped that the bankruptcy charges would put her away for a long time, as she was facing up to 50 years in prison. However, that was not the case. Hoffman's life was barely altered by her 12 months behind bars. Following her release, she met and married her 5th husband and changed her name to Terri Lelia Keenly. She died on October the 31st, 2015, aged 77.